Welcome to this podcast series from the School of Teacher Education at Charles Sturt University, Australia. Hello, my name is Tara Brabazon, and we live in an age of not only university academics completing research, which they've always done, but that research being assessed, being evaluated. Whether we talk about the RAE, the REF, the ERA, all of our attention is on outcomes and outputs and productivity. But how do you get to that productivity? And how do you enact the research planning that's required to get you there? Well, to help with this discussion about research planning in difficult times for research in higher education, it's my pleasure to have a very relaxed conversation by the beach with Professor Steve Redhead. And Steve, there's no doubt that this research planning, research productivity is becoming a real concern in the contemporary university. So the key problem, I think, with scholars we deal with when we're dealing with research planning is that academics become overwhelmed. So how do you think we stop university academics, how do we stop our colleagues being overwhelmed by research to break it down and create a plan?
Well, one way is to take leave, which is what we're doing at the moment, which is why we're in Western Australia by the Indian Ocean. And it's quite ironic that in England, in the UK today, the REF, the Research Excellence Framework for 2013, has now been announced in 2014. And if you just follow on social media and any other platforms, there is all sorts of chaos going on in the UK as a result of that debate about whether these sorts of systems are useful or useless. But there is definitely a completely different sort of regulation of research, even compared to 20 years ago, I think. And Australia, where we're working now, is actually catching that bug. And we were involved when we were at Murdoch University in early systems, the RQF,
yes,
in Australia. And we're now at Charles Sturt University, which, like all universities in Australia, is caught by the Excellence in Research in Australia. This time 2015, the last time was 2 or 3 years ago. And I think increasingly this idea of league tables of research is a big thing, and it's a big thing with consequences. I think that's part of the problem of the environment, and planning for that actually is really difficult.
It is, because it can be, Steve, very different from an individual research plan. This podcast is about research planning, but I think we need to recognise that an individual's career, an individual's research plan could be very much disconnected from an institution that they're working at. And then, of course, they may move institutions. They may move
or countries,
jobs
like
or countries in our case. So there's a necessity, I think, to recognise that what is in your individual interest, I would argue you need to hold on to quite a lot. I say a lot to my colleagues, particularly my early to mid researcher colleagues, you've got to be selfish. And that's rare for me because I'm, a social justice part of the community, be part of the scholarly community, intellectual generosity kind of gal. But actually, with all the competing demands of teaching and research and administration, it is important that you're selfish. So you made the point, Steve, we're sitting here on our holidays, that during these holidays, these are very precious days for us, you're finishing off your 16th book.
Yep.
I'm finishing off my 17th book, which is an edited collection with my colleagues from my school.
Yep.
So all of them are getting a publication out of this book. And I'm also writing our next book with Dr. Leanne McRae, yourself and myself. We're constructing that. So we use these pivotal times like our holidays to do the sustained work. We only have really 20 work days, and we often try to pretty well get the foundation of a book out each of our holidays. So that's a great example of don't be overwhelmed, use the time that's available to you, but also in some ways don't be overwhelmed by university policies
or timelines
or sector policies because, and I'm the first to say, look, an ERA, if the deadline is December and you've got an article that's close, punch that one through. You're not going to get an argument from me about that, but also you've got to think beyond the research assessments, because that great book that'll make your career for 20, 30, 40 years is not going to fit in with institutional research evaluations.
No, and I think the timelines are important. If you have timeline, say, like I do at the moment, which is, as you say, I'm very much finishing off one book, but I'm actually thinking now of how I'm going to do the next one, which we've done a number of podcasts on, Theoretical Times,
yes,
which I see as a book really to be written over the next 2 years. So that's the timeline, and that actually, being on leave has actually helped me work out that timeline. So I don't think it's just a matter of, a plan. I think it's planning. I think it's working out timelines for yourself and not being, as you say, completely beholden to the university or the system's timelines. And I think that's really difficult to do.
Yes.
Very, very rarely do you get a chance to do it. And I've tended to do that. When I'm on leave, I tend to think like that. I try and not do too much and let the planning develop.
That's very wise. And what's interesting is that's particularly appropriate to the first suite of questions I want to go into, the first series of topics I want to talk about, particularly for early career researchers. And you and I have spent a lot of time thinking about PhD students, in particular PhD candidates, and the doctoral experience is a very specific one, and it is changing in ways that make both you and I very uncomfortable, I think. But if you are a PhD student, Steve, how are those guys and gals to manage that pressure to publish during a doctorate?
Well, certainly what is happening within these systems is that the staff are under pressure, say in the ERA 2015 and certainly in the REF UK 2013, which has just been announced in 2014. The staff are the people under pressure. And what happens, I think, and I've seen it in these different systems, including actually in Canada, which doesn't have these sorts of systems, that the staff are under pressure to publish. And they then hand down the pressure to their PhD students to publish with them.
Yes.
I think that's the biggest connection to this overall environment. And I just think that the PhD student has somehow got to cope with the PhD itself and concentrate on that, and then maybe as a secondary thing think about publications, and then as a tertiary thing think about publications with their supervisors.
Yeah.
Whereas actually it's the other way around.
Yes.
And because of these pressures through the system, through these evaluation and assessment systems, it's the staff who are pressurising students to publish with them.
Yes, and this is a disaster, and so in some ways that's a devolved pressure. It's particularly
That's
in an
exactly
ERA type system, the Australian system, when it's not quality. It's not
It's
about
quantity.
submitting the full publications. People pretend it's about quality, but really
It's quantity.
It's about crunching it out.
Yeah.
So because it's been made about crunching it out, the PhD supervisors have literally used their PhD students as fodder.
Absolutely.
As you said, we've seen it in Canada a lot as well, without the evaluative framework. And I was always really proud of you because you did this in a public speech which had a major resonance right throughout Twitter when you actually reminded PhD students that they own their own work.
Yes.
So why were you so staunch on that in that speech?
Because I've always believed that it is central to the PhD experience that the student chooses their own topic and
Yes.
actually works within their own topic. And then after that, in a sense, they can do what they like, but they've still got to finish the PhD, and that is the priority. So, yes, I did something which I called In Their Own Right, W-R-I-T.
Yes.
And R-I-G-H-T.
Yes, yeah, clever.
Which was about ownership of, that's ownership of their own work. Yeah, I think that's exactly what I believe.
Yeah, so it is very important if you're a PhD student, remember you are enrolled in a PhD, your primary priority is to get that doctorate to the highest standard you can and submit it.
Yep.
That's the gig. Then, as Steve said, the secondary gig is think about what can I publish out of this and show the single-authored expertise.
Yep.
In hopefully open access journals because everyone can read that and that will get you a job. Then at a tertiary level, write with the supervisors if it suits you rather than the supervisor. And as I always say to PhD students, guys, don't start in this problem. Actually ask the prospective PhD supervisors at the start what their feelings about publishing with students are. Ask them that, get an overt answer, perhaps even in writing, and make your decision about who's going to be your supervisor on the basis of who is going to own your work. Because trust me, that's going to become really important. So Steve, the PhD student issue concerns us, and I think we've resolved it in some ways there.
We should say that to listeners that the Fremantle doctor is in. That means, for those who don't know Western Australia, that the wind coming from Fremantle or from the Indian Ocean
but it is a cleansing, cooling
cleaning
breeze.
And sunning us.
Yes, so apologies if there's a bit of wind, but it feels fantastic from this side. So I hope vicariously you're feeling the Fremantle doctor as well. But there's our PhD question, and one of my great colleagues, a great friend of mine, a wonderful human being in my school at CSU Burlington, Dr. Randa Qatar, she's an early career researcher, and we did a great podcast talking through the challenges she faces as an ECR. And the particular problem she expressed was she had 6 what she called almost half-finished pieces. So on a hard drive, she had 6 pieces that none of which were finished, but were going well. And she wanted to know how she actually got the 6 into journals. So I introduced the idea of low-hanging fruit to her. So what that means, guys, is work out which is the piece that is closest to publication, work 100% on that, and then submit it and publish it, then move to the next closest to publication, then the next. So the early career researchers, again, they seem the group that are heavily overwhelmed, Steve. What other advice would you offer to colleagues like Randa and the hundreds of thousands of early career researchers out there?
I think there are structural things, and one of the things that you've introduced as head of school, and I've been participating in it as professor, is that you have writing groups which are actually looking at particularly this sort of work, like Randa's work. The whole of the school, including Burlington, including Dubbo and Bathurst,
Yes.
Burlington, Canada, and Dubbo and Bathurst in New South Wales, they're able to benefit from, particularly professors like us, but also other senior researchers who can come along and have a look at that sort of work, not finished, and advise them. I think that's a really good structural thing. And in terms of policy of university schools, I think that's great. And it's shown, it's actually improved the work of people in this position. And I think they benefit greatly from it. They've been pushed to actually show people their work.
Yes.
But I agree with you. I think open access journalism, which I'm very much in favour of, is a very good way of pushing people to do work like that. And also, I think you just do have to mentor people. I've done a lot of mentoring since I came to CSU, and I've found that staff in this position, very often they've just got so many other pressures.
Yes.
Family, obviously work.
High teaching load,
and including this pressure that's coming down from on high, the ERA or the REF or wherever it is. And I think you've somehow got to individually mentor people and say, look, it is actually all about you. And it's
Yes.
a matter of trying to finish the stuff that's on your hard drive.
yeah.
And
take it one piece at a time, too.
Yes. And that's why the SOAP writing group is good, because you get a chance to submit to a group of people the piece that you're writing.
Yeah.
And that will then be looked at, and it may be a matter of coming back to that group of people and seeing how close it is to publication. But collegial work like that is absolutely brilliant in my view. But very often it's going to be mentoring by somebody else that's going to help you.
Yeah.
Because by definition the person is in early career research, hasn't really started, but has stuff that they would like to get out.
Yes.
And it's a lot of it is confidence.
I agree. And also focusing on one piece at a time. I mean, I know a lot of my colleagues, a lot of my mates say to me, oh, Tara, you've got 176 articles. And guys, what I'd say to you is you don't start out thinking you're going to write 176 articles. You write one at a time. Here's an idea. Write this up, send it to a journal, get referee feedback, it's published. And that just goes on one foot in front of the other. So I think the other thing is, don't make publishing any bigger than it is. It is writing, it is drafting. Remember, the best writing is edited. We all write crap first drafts, all of us. Maybe you don't, Steve, but I certainly do. I write really dreadful first drafts, and great writing comes from great editing, spending the time quietly sitting with your prose.
But so, you are also fearless. And
yeah.
you, as we've discussed in a number of these podcasts before, it can be really frightening, literally frightening, sending things off and getting what are very often harsh rejections. And you have to develop a thick skin, but that's actually a very difficult thing to do. And you've overcome that by incredible fearlessness over the years, to a point where you aren't bothered by the rejection.
No.
And you certainly do still get rejections, as everybody does.
Oh, thanks for sharing.
No, everybody does.
As
but the
everybody
point
does.
is, you've not got to, I would say, you've not got to let that dissuade you.
No, I mean...
And it's very difficult to get into that mindset.
Exactly, and let's see if this helps anybody. I'm 45 years of age, so I'm very, very old, but I tell you what I have learnt in handling referee reports. I now actually welcome referee reports. I love referee reports, because at my stage of seniority, people are rarely honest with me anymore, Steve, to be frank with you.
Well, that's interesting.
And so for me, I welcome it, because it's an opportunity. I try and get 10 publications in some form every year, books or articles or book chapters, and so for somebody at my level of seniority, I get 30 people commenting on my work to improve it. And for me, I treat that now as a gift. And I'm not too bothered about the weird, emotional stuff or the abusive stuff or the nasty stuff. I am grateful that somebody has spent 3 or 4 hours thinking about my work, and I thank them for the feedback which I use. So at my stage of my career, I am just happy to keep learning.
Well, that's a great attitude, but it's much more difficult for an early career researcher to have that attitude. And I think somehow it has to be inculcated into you, because many people just give up. I've seen lots and lots of people who are very bright early career researchers, and they give up and go and do something else.
Yep.
Because it can be such a harsh, cruel world for them.
What I would advise, this is where Steve's point about mentoring may be significant too, guys, is find a mentor. And it's amazing I'm saying this, because I'm not a big fan of mentors, but if you are freaked out by referee reports, for example, find a really trustworthy professor or associate professor or reader in the British system who is a mate of yours and who really cares about you, not how they can use you to get your career on, but mates who care. And get them to just buy you a cup of coffee and sit down with the referee reports and show you how to access it. I do it with a lot of my colleagues in my School of Teacher Education, but do that. If that's the blockage for you, then find a mate to get you through that.
I think that's a good point. But also, there can be ways of developing collegiality without that. You can have, for example, if you're involved in a research centre or even research clusters, and you're early career researcher, then you can benefit from writing with other people and doing collective seminars and papers and so on. That sort of thing, which was, I think, at one time the main way that people learned and developed, and it has gone in many ways in this new entrepreneurial global university. But I think there's still possibilities for that, and we shouldn't forget that. Say research clusters is a good example. You're working with other people at a similar level to you, and you can benefit. You can write with each other and so on. And
find good and kind people who care for you. That's my only worry. Is that in the old days there used to be a fair whack of those people, I think, and now because of the nature of these research assessments, it's become very ruthless and very self-absorbed. So find a mate who cares about you and your career, and it'll make a real difference. Steve, I wanted to move to an area that I still have a lot of challenges on. In my head, I really don't know how to help the guys and gals who are in positions like this. Graham Turner, my great mentor, a wonderful human being who really I met when I was 25, and he changed my life, but he often said to me, that the mid-career period is actually the crisis period in the academic life. It's the pivot, it's that difficult period where grants are very difficult to achieve as an individual. Publications are tough to sustain. You can get 1, 2, 3, 10, 20 publications, but how do you move to the programmatic publications of 100, say? And also promotion to senior lecturer or principal lecturer in the UK is very tough. So this is the period where we see people broken and beaten and emotionally quite damaged, I think, by academic life. What do you recommend for the mid-career researchers?
And I think it's interesting that Graham Turner said that, and he's been a major influence in Australia and internationally in cultural studies, and still, having left the academy, still having a major influence in these fields. And I think that's significant that he said that. He knew what he was talking about.
And every respect to Graham too. We'll send you the link, Graham.
And I think he's right that the mid-career researcher and how they get out of their problems is a really difficult situation. I've seen a lot of this, and I'm not sure how you easily get out of it, because they're the people in many ways most under pressure in the systems that we're talking about. ERA 2015 in Australia, REF 2013 reported in 2014 in the UK. And I do think they're going to be under more and more pressure, actually. The people who are able to get out of the pressures are the people in the elite institutions in these systems. And they're the ones, interestingly, on Twitter saying this system doesn't matter, okay? Because, of course, they're already in the ensconced in schools and faculties and universities that are at the top. And they're at the top of their game. But actually, the people in mid-career, in, if you like, not the Group of 8 in Australia, for example, or the Russell Group in the UK, they're in the biggest difficulties, I think, because they're now put under impossible pressure. And of course, like everybody else, they want to move on up the system, and they want either to move from a university that's in the middle to a higher one or whatever, but they also want to move their position from mid-career research to really established research positions, and I think that's almost impossible now. What you get actually is the elites reproducing themselves in these systems. In the original systems in the UK, the whole reason for starting this stuff was so that late 80s, early 90s, was actually to make sure that the polytechnics, which became universities in 1992, did not get the large slice of the research funding that they deserved. And actually the system worked. They didn't get it. As new universities, they didn't. And a lot of mid-career researchers that I saw who were very, very good and really on the up in that system just stopped. Their careers were killed, really, because they believed in the system and they believed that they could actually get rewarded. And in fact, the whole thing was skewed. It was deliberately skewed. I think it's a bit different in Australia because you don't get those divisions. But I still think you get, basically, what the Group of 8 is interested in. That's what the system produces or reproduces. So I think mid-career researchers are going to have it much tougher, actually, as these systems really buy. I don't think we've seen anything yet.
And what the advice I'd offer too for the mid-career researchers listening to this is, can I just express our solidarity with you? And what I would say, and this is Steve's career and my career, guys, we had to fight to get here. The thing I would state is this wasn't easy. This was applying for promotion, being absolutely humiliated in interviews for promotion, dreadful people who you wouldn't let clean your shoes, offering commentary about your research. And, I'll say particularly as a woman, but I'm sure Steve will offer a commentary as well. The nature of Australian higher education is women are held in the lower levels, and the stats show that. So what you often have to find to move from a mid-career researcher to get up a bit is you have to move institutions.
Or disciplines, actually.
Or disciplines,
or clusters. Steve. I think that's, you're right, but actually one of the things that I did was my original background was law and criminology, and as that system that I'm talking about bit in the UK, which was around the late 80s, early 90s, as polytechnics were becoming universities, so there were almost a doubling of the number of universities and real threat to the research money that was around. That's when I started the Unit for Law and Popular Culture at Manchester Metropolitan University, which eventually merged with another centre to become the Manchester Institute for Popular Culture.
Yes. And
I was on the cover of Newsweek and all that sort of thing, but still couldn't get jobs anywhere apart from the job that I had, partly because the area was an area of popular culture, which wasn't necessarily regarded highly in the academy. But I think I did actually benefit from moving interdisciplinary, in an interdisciplinary trajectory, which moved me away from my original work in law and criminology, which I've actually come back to later on. But that helped me as a mid-career researcher. I couldn't get arrested in those other areas because the elite universities cleaned up. Whereas actually, when Derek and I started Manchester Institute for Popular Culture,
Derek Wynne,
we actually did get money from funding bodies, and particularly eventually in Europe, which meant we had millions of dollars. And everybody around the world wanted to come to us.
Yes.
So you can do it by moving within clusters, within interdisciplinary fields. That's one way you can move on and up.
Yes, so let's just quickly go through that again for the mid-career researchers. So you may find you have to move institutions,
yes,
okay?
To
to get promotion, you're going to have to move about. That was certainly my narrative. Yep. I got trapped in multiple universities that would not promote me or just went, no, you're a teacher. That was my problem early on too.
Yeah.
I had written all these books and all these articles, but I was seen to be a great teacher and I couldn't move from that box.
Yeah.
So you may have to move universities, you may have to move countries, that's the deal.
Yeah.
But Steve's point is a great one, that think about moving sideways, think about interdisciplinary relationships. Also, thirdly, think about the next big thing.
Yeah.
So if you see, and again, if you know, particularly as a mid-career researcher, you know what's going to be the next big thing. You're in the middle of it. So you have a view that other people don't have. You see the thing that's coming. So get on that wave and start to market and brand yourself in and through that phrase. And Steve, I'll give you a great example that some of our mid-career colleagues are doing. Physical cultural studies is a big new phrase.
Yeah. What used to be sociology of sport.
Yes, and so that new phrase, if you look at the people that are really starting to appear in the readers and for all the different international publishers, they are mid-career researchers that have picked it right.
Yeah.
So guys, look for that. So I hope those suggestions are useful to you. But I just wanted to make sure that you knew that we express solidarity with you, that it is incredibly difficult and frustrating and it makes you cry and you just feel like you're trapped. So I really recognise that, and it is shocking, but you've got to create that movement. You've got to, through thinking, through moving careers, you've really got to get that momentum back into your life.
That's right.
Yeah. Now, of course, you know where we're heading, wonderful podcast listeners. And in some ways, this was the trigger for this entire podcast. Everyone's been talking about research planning and so forth, but I really wanted to log something very serious that I think is happening in our universities. And I wanted to talk about senior scholars. And senior scholars are under huge pressure in the contemporary university system. And there have been some recent cases that were publicised last week, actually, of bullying and indeed a suicide of a senior British colleague. So this is very serious, and nothing is worth killing yourself over. Nothing is worth doing that, but it shows you the scale of the bullying about research that's occurring. So what would you recommend to colleagues, senior colleagues, in the management of this stress and this pressure?
Yes, I think this is a very serious, widespread problem. And what criminologists would call the dark figure is around here, which is basically a lot of this stuff goes unreported or unnoticed. You're absolutely right to draw attention to a couple of examples which have been globally in the media recently. But I mean, when we were we went to UIT in Canada, in Ontario, Canada, when we arrived, we learnt of the suicide of a staff member in the faculty that we were joining the year before.
Yeah.
And nobody knew about it. So I think these things happen, and I actually think this is one of the outputs of this new research environment and the new managerialism. And I think the new managerialism has got to take a very strong look at itself and concern itself with the outputs. If these are the sorts of things that are happening, then there's something seriously wrong.
Yeah.
And obviously, on an individual basis, senior colleagues, senior managers have really got to look at this situation, but collectively too. This is a new, as I say, global entrepreneurial university system.
Yeah.
We've not actually been here before.
No.
You know, we've been staggering towards it for a long time, but these evaluation systems, about which there's so much debate, are actually part of a systematic change to the global university. Yes. They're becoming businesses to such an extent that, you know, one of the cases that you're talking about actually involved a member of staff who was getting £150,000 research money per year.
Per year.
Okay, pounds.
Yes.
And was questioned because that wasn't enough, or it wasn't enough under a target that had suddenly been introduced.
Been invented.
Yeah, and I think we're not talking here about early or mid-career researchers. You're talking about top academics being looked at by new managerial systems. Yeah. And as I say, we've not been really in a global business university system before. We are now.
Well, and I mean, E.P. Thompson was right.
Warwick University Limited.
He was right. And one of the reasons, and I've really talked about this, Steve, but one of the reasons I decided to move into a head of department job at Bolton and then a head of school job at Charles Sturt University is I was so disgusted isn't right, horrified, embarrassed, saddened beyond belief at the bullying that I was seeing. And I'm calling a spade a shovel there. Bullying, attacks on people. Yep. And I thought the time...
Systematic.
And I can grumble bum and complain about it and write a podcast about it, or you can actually intervene and become, you know, one of those middle managers, if you will, become a head of school and construct an environment of an open door, of respectfulness, of integrity, of compassion, because nothing is worth killing yourself over. No. And nothing is worth bullying anybody. Come to every situation with respect. Yeah. And we're in a situation now, as you've said, that, you know, most universities I've been at, in fact, all of the 8 universities I've been at, I think, someone has killed themselves during the process, during the time I have been there. And, you know, no one speaks of it. In the cases that we're talking about, the gentleman involved, I think, organised an automated email to be sent sometime after his death to many people, so it actually got some publicity and heat. But we don't hear about these cases. So all I would say, again, expressing solidarity to senior colleagues is you know, reach out. Whether it be reach out to HR, reach out to senior colleagues, heads of school, deans, brother and sister professors to support you, because, you know, you matter. Your life matters, your career matters, and you are enough.
And it starts with the enough. Yes, and I think it starts with the individual senior managers, and we're senior managers in many senses ourselves. And you're absolutely right. You've got responsibility in these positions to do the things properly.
With kindness.
Absolutely.
With respect.
And yes, treat people with respect, but also to apply the policies properly. Because all the universities we're talking about have anti-bullying policies and so on, but they are systematic systems which actually push people in the other direction. Yeah. This is a really serious... This isn't kind of, you know, a few accidental problems. This is a serious part of the system. Yeah. And I think that we are individually responsible. We have to take personal responsibility if we're in management positions and really fight for systems which are fairer. It's going to mean better regulation, change, you know, reform within these systems. Yeah. Can't have this.
Yeah, and also, of course, you end up destroying the thing you're trying to create too. That research, writing, comes from feeling free. Having the mental space to think and grow and challenge and take risks and, you know, I'm not a coffee drinker, you are a coffee drinker. Have coffee with people, talk through ideas. The collegiality is what creates the really fabulous research, to create an environment of risk-taking, to actually find those innovative interdisciplinary links. That is where the brilliant stuff comes from. And any sort of bullying environment that's saying you must produce this number of outputs by this time crushes the very thing you're trying to create.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
And that for me is stunning. So in the final couple of bits of this podcast, Steve, I wanted to talk about concrete strategies for podcast listeners who are listening today to start their planning today. So after this podcast finishes, what can they do to develop their research plan? So I'll give you an example and then we'll find out what you do, Steve. But every December, and I'm in December now, every December I get a whiteboard and I write down 5 or 6 areas or topics for the year to come. So they are at that stage a vibe, like I'm interested in this, and this. I think that's terribly important. Let's put those on the whiteboard, and then I pick the easiest one and I write that one first. So that's a concrete strategy for a year. That is what I do. So whatever else comes on the way through, so invited book chapters or all those other things that accidentally land in your lap through the year, that's great. But I always have 5 or 6 projects, topics that come from me, that are part of my agenda, not somebody else's.
Yeah.
Do you have any tricks like that?
I tend to do it through walks. So we were walking at 5 a.m. this morning by the Indian Ocean, which listeners can hear in the background, not very far from where we're staying at my parents-in-law. And I think I've often got inspiration from those walks, and I did again today about things that I want to try and plan. And I have an office in this house, which is a narrow office in a lovely house in Mandarin, Western Australia.
But it's not even big enough. In England, it's not even big enough for a box room for British listeners.
But I've always really, ever since 2001, my post-2001 publications have all been nurtured here, or even started here with ideas.
Yes.
So somehow the environment has helped me. So walking or just sitting around and watching the cricket and suddenly realising that there's an idea. So I think you've got to get an environment as well, as you've got to be able to choose something you want to do. But how you get those ideas in the first place is part of the issue, and how you then put them into a planning timeline. But actually the ideas in the first place are really difficult. Sometimes I've been on these walks and then been in these offices and nothing comes. So don't worry about it.
Yeah, and I mean, that's interesting. Steve is very environmentally focused. He works in a context. I can work anywhere, and one of the reasons I come up with those 5 or 6 ideas is so that I'm not ever panicked, because I, as a lot of listeners know, I get up very, very early. I get up at 2:30 in the morning, and when I get up in the morning, the afternoon before, I've always planned what I'm going to do the next day. So I wake up, make a cup of coffee, and I immediately use those 2 hours. So maybe find something between the pair of us. I think it's very important to be relaxed and let the ideas come. I think that's incredibly important. If there's an environment in which you work well, then use that environment well. But what I would also say is do try to plan 3 or 4 or 5 topics for the following year, because they are in, then you've got ideas that you have control over. You've got control over your research trajectory rather than other people controlling it.
And something you want to do. I know we're going back to that original idea, but that is crucial.
Yeah. Look, it really is. And I suppose that's one of the other reasons we really developed this podcast, because we're becoming increasingly worried that particularly early career researchers, their entire career is like a wagon behind somebody else's train. And, you know, that's got to stop, because it's you being brilliant. We are university academics. Our job is to be brilliant. Our job is to be amazing, create new ideas, new connections that no one in the history of the planet has seen. That's what we're meant to do. And you don't do that by grabbing the coattails of other people or being suppliant to other people's agendas, I think.
And you have to take seriously that idea within a PhD, which is that it's an original contribution to knowledge.
Yeah.
We almost accept it as a sort of banal statement, but it's not.
Yeah. And also, don't judge yourself too strongly. There are some days that you're not going to write well.
Yep.
And that's really, really true. I found it even on this trip. I'm being really honest with you. I was so frantic the week before we took this leave. This first week, I've had meetings and all sorts of things, and I've been not writing well, not my best writing, but I've kept writing. So I've written the more incremental writing of this book that I'm doing. So I'm just pottering about, writing paragraph after paragraph, knowing it's not brilliant, but getting the ideas down in some form, and that's okay.
While I've been watching the cricket.
Yes, while you've been watching the cricket, that's your call. But some people, you're going to have great days, you're going to have bad days, but the key is every day write something. That's the key. Last strategy, which again is the very easy strategy for listeners to take home immediately from this podcast, and one that this does freak me out, this does worry me, that I think early and mid-career researchers really stuff this up. I have a belief that every single presentation you do should and must become an article. And I think the great problem is people spend all this money going to all these conferences, often doing the same piece over and over again, and never actually at any point write it up, or indeed write it formally up beyond sort of pretty basic proceedings to and for a conference. I'll continue talking about that in a second, but what's your strategy and commentary about presentations and pieces and articles?
I think that's one way out of the dilemma we were talking about earlier on in the podcast, especially with these systems like the RAF in the UK and the ERA in Australia. If people really are going to be put under these pressures, and there's no doubt in my view that they are going to be put under greater pressure in the next few years in these systems, then presentations at conferences are going to have to be turned into product in this entrepreneurial university system. That means not giving the same paper all the time.
In fact, it means a different one every time.
I think it really is demanding a different strategy, and I think you're right about that. And people do go to conferences a lot of the time, and they get the same paper, and they don't really ever produce very much from it. And it's a networking system, and if you want to do that, that's great. It's a way of getting jobs and all sorts of other things. But I think the new environment in universities with these assessment systems is demanding a completely different attitude to conferences. I don't think you can do what you did before. I really don't.
No.
So I think what you're suggesting is imperative.
Yeah, and also treat it as an opportunity. If you're going to spend all that money and waste all that time in airports, I'm funny on this because I hate travelling, but if you're going to waste all that time, then force yourself in the weeks before it to make it a great piece. So what I do, and I'm testing myself next year, I'm doing 2 keynotes. I've chosen to do them on brand new topics that haven't been done before. I'm writing them in January for delivery in February and March, and in February and March I'm writing them up as articles, and they're in my list of publications for next year. So it's important you do that. The other point I wanted to raise, Steve, is even if you're doing a really tiny piece, and I've done this a lot as head of school, we've had to do sort of small talks to interest groups, groups of principals, all that sort of stuff. Even these sort of micro presentations I've written up into journalism. So when I've had to do what perhaps is not an overtly academic piece but more of a professional piece, I haven't just let that speech sit on the hard drive. I've written it up, and colleagues who have seen my pieces in the Times Education Supplement, for example, or Campus Review or The Australian, those pieces started life as a little talk that was done for an interest group. So every single speech you do, try to configure it into a mode of writing, and you never know, 2 or 3 of those pieces of journalism may end up in a different form in years to come when you're looking for a piece, actually become refereed work as well.
Yeah, that's great advice, and it's practical. It's a practical way of solving the problem that we started with in this podcast.
Yeah, so for the guys and gals, if ever you're asked, say, to do a presentation for an orientation, for our first year students, an orientation for PhD students, every single word that you write, make sure that it goes somewhere. And there's all sorts of fabulous online newspaper formations and formats that exist at the moment. Make the words travel. So, Steve, thank you so much for this conversation. This has been an important one, and as you can probably hear, it got more and more serious as it progressed, because this is a concern, and it's a concern for the entire sector. That's why I broke this discussion down to early career, in fact, PhD, early career, mid-career and seniors, because all of us are confronted by the consequences of research assessment. And it has incredible value because we are paid by the public purse, and that's very important, that we are paid by the public purse and we have to demonstrate our public profile and accountability. That's tremendous. But we also have to recognise there are other unintended outputs, as you said, and we have to manage those with respect and care, and also acknowledge perhaps the long-term legacy of these types of systems on academics' career.
I agree.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this podcast from the School of Teacher Education at Charles Sturt University. For more information about our teaching, our research and our courses, please refer to www.csu.edu.au.